Fellas, International Fight Week is usually the biggest week in MMA. You get a massive Hall of Fame ceremony, you get other big events, and to top it all off, you get one of the most stacked cards of every year. So I'm going to be ranking every International Fight Week card of the last 10 years, from worst to best, from number 1 to number 10. And we'll start off with this week's International Fight Week card, UFC 317. Now, obviously, compared to the other cards, this hasn't gone down, so I'm going to be ranking this purely based on how good it is on paper. And the main event, Topuria versus Oliveira, might actually be one of the best International Fight Week headliners we've ever had. I think this will go down as one of the biggest fights in modern UFC history. Obviously, the tenacity of Ilia Topuria versus the technicality of Charles Oliveira. It's a huge fight. The former featherweight undefeated champion moving up to face the former lightweight champion Charles Oliveira. It's a huge fight, one of the biggest in MMA right now. And like I said, I think it will go down as one of the best International Fight Week headliners. It's straight heat. And then you've got Pantoja versus Kara France, the co-main event. Maybe it doesn't have the star power for International Fight Week, but it's still a fun fight. Pantoja's always in banger fights. Kara France is one of the more dangerous dudes at 125. It does seem like Pantoja's kind of having to lap the division, but it's still a fairly fresh contender. And then in terms of the rest of the cards, there's still some other good fights on there. Royval versus Van, Talbot versus Lima, Hermanson versus Rodriguez. I do think it does lack the name value for an International Fight Week card. It is top heavy. It has got banger fights. Doesn't really have the consistent name value, but we'll put it at number 1 just because obviously there's nothing else to compare it to right now. It's a solid card. I'm happy with this week's International Fight Week. So UFC 317, solid card. 2024. Pereira versus Prohaska, number 2. Now, this was supposed to be McGregor versus Chandler, number 1. The big return of Conor McGregor. And then, obviously, a few weeks before, McGregor ends up pulling out. We get a sick replacement in Pereira versus Yuri, number 2. And it was a sick fight. Pereira dominates Yuri, ends up finishing him pretty early on in the second round. The co-main event was supposed to be Ortega versus Lopez. That also ends up falling short last minute, and we get Dan Ige stepping up on short notice. So then we get Dan Ige versus Lopez as the co-main event. And I'm going to be honest, it was quite a weak co-main event for International Fight Week. I know it was short notice. The UFC couldn't really do anything. But you've got Dan Ige, who's basically a gatekeeper for the top 15. Diego Lopez, who at this time only had a run-ranked win. Diego Lopez beats him by decision. And then the rest of the card, there was a lot of questionable fights for an International Fight Week card. Ian Gary versus MVP was a really bad fight. We had a women MMA fight on the International Fight Week's main card. Smith versus Delidia was absolutely awful. I know there was a lot of pullouts that caused this, but all the pullouts kind of led to it being a pretty awful main card. The prelims were solid, though. We had Joe Pyfer flatline Marc-Andre Barriault. Peyton Talbot knocked out a can. We had Gene Silver on the prelims as well, knocking out Charles Jourdain. So I thought the prelims were solid. I thought the main card was awful. But for an International Fight Week card, didn't really stand out. It was very bang average, or to be honest, a below average card for just a standard pay-per-view card. So International Fight Week, it's going to go behind at UFC 317. UFC 290 in 2023, headlined by Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez. This was a fire card, and that was when Yair actually deserved the title fight. Volkanovski beat the crap out of Yair Rodriguez across the time that the fight lasted. Absolutely destroyed him on the feet. And then the second that the fight started shifting in Yair's favor, Volkanovski clops him with a massive right hand, goes for the TKO finish. It was a sick main event. Pantoja versus Moreno in the co-main event. This might have been one of the best fights, if not the best fight of 2023. It was a dogfight, 2 flyweights, like 2 frogs in a blender, just going at it for 25 minutes, and we get the beginning of Pantoja's title reign. Featured fight, Dricus versus Whittaker. One of the biggest upsets in modern UFC history. We had Dricus finishing Whittaker as a massive underdog and having that face-off with Izzy. We had Dan Hooker versus Jalin Turner, another fight of the year contender for 2023. That was a banger. And then we had Bo Nickel knocking out the GOAT Val Woodburn to kick off the main card. And even the rest of the card, we had one of the greatest retirements of all time with Robbie Lawler as he flatlined Nico Price in 40 seconds. And look at the prelims as well. The amount of finishes and early finishes on the prelims as well. Only 4 out of 13 fights in this card were decisions, and 2 of them were fight of the year contenders. It was a 10 out of 10 card. So I'm going to have to put International Fight Week 2023 UFC 290 as the best International Fight Week out of these 3 so far. You couldn't have asked for a better International Fight Week card. It was better in every way. International Fight Week 2023, UFC 290 is going to go at number 1. And then we had UFC 276, Adesanya versus Cannonier for 2022. Now, this was a really good card on paper. I mean, look at some of the names you had on this card. You had prospects, you had veterans, you had obviously big names at the time. It was super stacked on paper. I know some of the big names, obviously, that we have now weren't necessarily big names back then. For example, Dricus and O'Malley weren't champions back then, but it was still a stacked card on paper. The main event, Adesanya versus Cannonier, though, let the card down. It was super boring. It was a standard Adesanya title fight, nothing across 25 minutes, boring headliner. The O'Malley versus Munoz fight on the main card, that ended up being a no contest, which kind of ruined things. It was a no contest at the beginning of the second round, and there was just a lot of decisions on the card as well that kind of made the card lackluster. There was a lot of weak prelims. We did have Volkanovski beat the absolute crap out of Max Holloway across 25 minutes, and in my opinion, his best career performance yet. We had Alex Pereira sending Sean Strickland to the Shadow Realm. We had Robbie Lawler get finished by Brian Bob Lennon, but we had to see Lola lose to this guy. And we had Jalin Turner submit Brad Riddell. It was a great card on paper, but I feel like it kind of underperformed the UFC 276. So right now I'm going to put UFC 276. I'm going to put it above the 2024 International Fight Week just because of how good it was on paper, and there was still decent fights on it. Much better main card than the one we had last year, but I'll put it at number 3. I don't think it's as good as this week's card on paper, but I think it's definitely better than UFC International Fight Week 2024. Then we had Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega at UFC 266. It seems to be a bit of a theme of Volkanovski being on International Fight Week. Now, obviously, these guys had the massive rivalry, not a massive rivalry, but the build-up from the Ultimate Fighter, and the fight was absolute heat. It was one of the best featherweight title fights we've had in the past couple of years. We had Volkanovski beating the crap out of Brian Ortega, but then we obviously had that moment where Ortega got Volkanovski in that tight guillotine. Volkanovski escapes. It was a sick title fight. They both just destroyed each other for 25 minutes. Volkanovski getting the decision win. One of the best fights of 2021, that was. Shevchenko versus Murphy is the co-main event where Shevchenko absolutely destroys Lauren Murphy in that fight as well. We had Lola versus Diaz 2, the comeback of Robbie Lawler, where it was a bit of a depressing fight to see, to be fair. Obviously, the return of Nick Diaz was hype, but he had no business being in there against any welterweight in the time in the octagon. And then the rest of the card, we had a few moments. We had Magic Marlon Moraes, which was a sick fight as he nearly finished Merab, and then Merab comes back and gets a finish. We had a couple other finishes as well. Chris Stoker's getting a good finish. Jalin Turner pulling off a submission. It was a very top-heavy card, but it still had its moments. So UFC 266, I'm going to put this at number 5. I think the main event and the co-main event really carried this card. I mean, the main card, again, good main card. Prelims were kind of weak. I'm going to put it at number 5 so far. It wasn't necessarily a bad card, but I think we've definitely had better for International Fight Week. Then we had DC versus Cormier 3. Now, this was obviously in the Apex. This was back in 2020, which automatically deducts points for an International Fight Week card. We saw the trilogy between Stipe and DC, and it was kind of just eye poke mania. Eye pokes all over the place from both DC and Stipe, which kind of ruined the fight. It was a mid-fight overall. The Sean O'Malley fight on the card against Marlon Vera also was kind of ruined because O'Malley injured himself, so he couldn't really compete to his full potential, and injury ruined the card. And then you look at the rest of the fights on the card, nothing really went down. I mean, we had Rosenstrike versus Junior Dos Santos, which I guess was a big moment, but it was an awful card. And when Rosenstrike is the biggest highlight of International Fight Week, you already know a card's going bad. It was quite weak on paper to begin with. It had a terrible main event, and it was in the Apex. I'm going to have to put UFC 256 right at the back as the worst International Fight Week card on this list so far. Then we had 2019 Jones versus Santos, UFC 239, headlined obviously by Jones and Santos. This was a pretty good fight. It was kind of just John Jones destroying the knee of Thiago Santos as he was already injured coming into the fight for 25 minutes. It wasn't a boring fight. It was a pretty technical matchup across 25 minutes. It wasn't one of the best fights of the year, but it was a pretty respectable fight. Jones versus Santos, solid headline, and you had the name value of John Jones. In the co-main event, you had Amanda Nunes versus Holly Holm, where Amanda Nunes Holly Holm with the head kick, and that was a really good co-main event as well for Amanda Nunes. That was quite a big fight at the time. And then you had the infamous Ben Askren versus Jorge Masvidal, where Jorge Masvidal, after a massive rivalry, gets the quickest knockout in UFC history, flatlining Ben Askren in 6 seconds in what, in my opinion, is still one of the greatest knockouts in UFC history. Then we had Blachowicz versus Rockhold, former champion Luke Rockhold against Jan Blachowicz, where Jan Blachowicz just absolutely slumps Luke Rockhold, chins him pretty early on in the fight as well. And then in terms of the rest of the card, there were a couple of good moments. We had Edmund Shabazian pull off a submission. We had Song Yadong get a pretty brutal knockout. We had Marlon Vera get a submission too. It was a fucking fire card for International Fight Week. And you had the star power, like I said, Masvidal, Blachowicz, Rockhold, John Jones, Amanda Nunes, Holly Holm. You had star power. You had fun performances. You had highlight reels on the card. International Fight Week, Jones versus Santos, that's going to get number 4 for me. I think that was one of the best International Fight Weeks we had, and similar to UFC 290 at the top, it had everything. Star power, performances, highlight reels. International Fight Week, Jones versus Santos, that's going to get number 4. And then DC versus Stipe again, UFC 226 in 2018. Now, obviously, this was headlined by Miocic and Cormier, and it was a pretty decent fight. It was definitely better than the third fight, the trilogy. Stipe ends up finishing DC. DC had his moments in this fight. It was a pretty solid fight to headline International Fight Week. And then the co-main event, Ngannou versus Lewis, which we thought was going to be one of the best fights to put in this card, ended up going down as one of the worst fights in UFC history. You ask most people what the worst fight is or one of the most boring fights in UFC history, a lot of people are going to have Ngannou versus Lewis at the top of the list. So that kind of ruined the card. And apart from that, we had a couple good moments. We had Paulo Costa go out there and destroy Uriah Hall. We had Khalil Rountree, a massive underdog, get a KO win. We had Pettis versus Chiesa, which was a pretty decent fight. We had Dan Hooker knocking out Gilbert Burns on the prelims as well. So I'm going to put the second fight with DC and Stipe. I'm going to put it at number 7 and put it in above the third fight. You know, it was definitely better than the third fight that they had in the Apex. But again, nothing significant really stands out. Like I said, a couple of highlights throughout the card. And obviously the main event was better than the third one. But I'll put it at number 7. Stipe versus DC, number 2. I'll put that at number 7. Then we had Romero versus Whittaker, headlining International Fight Week. This was supposed to be Amanda Nunes versus Shevchenko 2, which was a massive fight at the time. And then Amanda Nunes ended up pulling out, I think, a couple hours before the card. We were also supposed to get Robbie Lawler versus Cowboy on this card. That ended up falling short a couple days before the card too. So the main event ended up being for the interim middleweight championship, Yoel Romero versus Robert Whittaker. And this was a good fight to begin with anyway. They were both on massive winning streaks in the ultimate form of their career. And it was a pretty solid fight. Romero being Romero obviously had his moments, but Whittaker looked amazing across 25 minutes and obviously became the interim champion. That was a fire main event, and even though it was a short notice one, I don't think anybody complained about that being a main event for International Fight Week, as Whittaker obviously ended up becoming the interim champion. Obviously, if you take away the main event, we had a decent fight between Pettis versus Jim Miller. We had a good finish on the card from Thiago Santos against GM3. We had a good submission on the card as well from Rob Font. We had Travis Brown ended up getting submitted as well. It had solid prelims. It did have a bit of a weaker main card though, because if you take away the main event, Romero or Whittaker, because of the pullouts, there wasn't really anything significant that took place on the main card. And Overeem versus Verdum and Curtis Blades in his fight, it was both trash. So I'm going to put this card, I'm going to put it in number 7, Romero versus Whittaker. The two guys in the main event saved the card. There was many pullouts last minute, which again, similar to UFC 303, kind of ruined the International Fight Week card, but it was still a solid fight card, still had its moments. I'll put it at number 7. Definitely not one of the best. Definitely not one of the worst. And then we have UFC 200. Now, this was a mega card. Obviously, UFC 100, 200, 300, they're meant to be some of the most stacked cards ever. And it was a mega card. You main evented with Miesha Tate versus Amanda Nunes, which is a pretty solid fight, with Amanda Nunes getting a quick early finish in the first round, as she normally performs for International Fight Week. We had the return of Brock Lesnar in the last time he competed in the Octagon, as he kind of just dominated Mark Hunt across 25 minutes, but obviously ended up getting overturned to a no contest because he was on every steroid in the book. We also had Cormier versus Silva, which was a bit of a random fight. It was quite a short notice fight, where DC wins. Wasn't a super fun fight, but he gets the win. We had Jose Aldo against Frankie Edgar, which was a massive fight at the time, where Aldo wins again. Wasn't a super interesting fight, but it still took place. A couple other moments, we had Cain Velasquez getting a good mauling on the card, and apart from that, there was quite a few decisions on the prelims too. It was one of the most stacked cards of all time. At the time, the amount of names that were on this card, the amount of legends that competed, it was one of the most stacked cards of all time. But I feel like it underperformed. The performances from the fighters on the card really let this card down, but because it was stacked, and we still had some decent fights throughout the card, I'm going to put UFC 200 at number 2 for the second best International Fight Week card we've ever had. So at number 1, it is going to be 2023's card, 2 years ago, International Fight Week UFC 290, as the greatest International Fight Week card in UFC history. Now, what made UFC 290 such a good card? Number 1, stacked on paper. You had the featherweight champ versus the interim champion back when Yaya actually deserved a title shot, not that the one he's going to get in 2025. You had a flyweight title fight in the co-main event, Moreno versus Pantoja number 3, and that was when Moreno was obviously the champion, and Pantoja was already 2-0 against Moreno, so it was a bit of a storyline there. You had Dricus versus Whittaker for a middleweight title eliminator. You had 2 ranked lightweights in Jalen Turner and Dan Hook. You had Robbie Lawler's retirement fight. You had some good prospects, Bo Nickel, Tatsuro Taira, Esteban Rubic, Vito Petrino, who were all prospects at the time, so it was a very stacked card on paper, which is what you want for International Fight Week. And number 2, it over-delivered. The prelims, let's just go through some of the prelims. The headliner of the prelims had Robbie Lawler with one of the greatest retirements of all time, as he knocks out Nico Price in 40 seconds. You had a 20-second women MMA KO. You had Medifield choking out Jimmy Crute. You had Petrino choking out Marcin Prachnio. You had Cameron Simon knocking out Terrence Mitchell. You had a 17-second KO as well, kicking off the prelims. This was a really solid set of prelims. You couldn't have asked for a better prelims for International Fight Week. And then you go to the main card. You had 2 Fight of the Year contenders from Jalen Turner, Dan Hooker, and Moreno and Pantoja. You had one of the biggest upsets in UFC history with Dricus and Whittaker. You had a prospect in Bo Nickel as he knocked out Val Woodburn pretty early on. And then you had Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez, a fun title fight in the featherweight division, and it ended up in a finish shot. International Fight Week 2023, definitely in my opinion, is the best one we've had so far if you take everything into account. But that is me ranking the last 10 years of International Fight Week cards. Let me know if you agree with this ranking, if you change anything about, and let me know why you think that, if you disagree, let me know why you don't think International Fight Week 2023 is the best, because I think UFC 290, honestly, this might be a bit of a hot take, but I don't think it should be, one of the greatest cards of all time. So let me know your thoughts on this ranking, and thank you for watching.